The real story presents a poignant historical narrative about the promise and betrayal of freedom for enslaved people in Mississippi after the Civil War. The narrative effectively shows how economic and legal systems can recreate bondage even after emancipation, with strong themes of hope, resilience, and systemic oppression. The cold Mississippi air carried whispers that tasted like fire. Huck, a man whose 40 years had etched themselves into his hands like the rows of cotton head tended since childhood, stood at the edge of the slave quarters, looking toward the big house. The rumor had arrived with a traveling preacher 2 days prior. President Lincoln was signing a paper, a proclamation, emancipation. Around him the night was alive with hushed, disbelieving voices. "You think it true, Huck?" asked Elijah, just 16, his eyes wide with a hope so fragile it scared Huck to look at. "Words on paper got to travel down the river to us, Eli," Huck replied, his voice a low rumble. "They got to get past the masters and the militias." But in his chest, something long frozen began to crack. He thought of his wife, Sarah, taken by fever 3 winters back. He thought of his daughter, Maisie, asleep in their cabin. He thought of the feel of a dollar earned, of land owned, of a day that began and ended by his own choosing. The promise arrived like a slow spring flood. By 1865, the war was over, and the word freedman was in everyone's mouth. At Davis Bend, once owned by Jefferson Davis' brother, there was a unique current of possibility. Old Joseph Davis had run things peculiar-like before the war, giving folks a taste of managing plots. Now, with the Union soldiers nearby and the Freedmen's Bureau talking of 40 acres and a mule, the taste became a hunger. Huck stood with a group of men before the old plantation office, now occupied by a weary but earnest bureau agent, Captain Aldridge. "The land is being parceled," Aldridge said, spreading a map. "You'll have contractual leases. You'll work it, sell the cotton, keep a share. It's a start. A start." Huck signed his X on the contract, his hand trembling not from fear, but from a terrible, hopeful strength. He was assigned 10 acres of bottomland near the river. That first morning, he and Maisie, now 12, stood at the border of their plot. The soil was dark and rich. "This ours to work, Papa?" Maisie asked, her hand in his. "For now, child," he said, "for now." They broke the earth together. He taught her to plant cotton, but in a small corner they sowed corn and beans, food for them, not for the market. For the first time, the sweat on his back felt like it belonged to him. They attended the new school set up in the old church. Hearing Maisie sound out letters was a sweeter sound than any bird song. On Sundays, Reverend Jacobs preached from Exodus, "The Lord brought us out with a mighty hand." The congregation shouted "Amen," so loud it shook the pine plank walls. But Huck noticed things. Captain Aldridge was replaced by a different agent, one who spoke less and frowned more. White planters from neighboring estates would ride along the property lines, their gazes long and calculating. And the promised mule? It never came. Huck borrowed a neighbor's plow, adding the debt of favor to his ledger of worries. One evening, Elijah, now a young man with a new wife, came to Huck's cabin, his face grim. "Heard from my cousin over at the Johnston place. They signed a contract too, but the landowner says it means they give him 2/3, not half. Says they can't read the fine print." Huck felt the first chill of the coming winter. The promise was real, but it was thin, like ice over deep water. He looked at his calloused hands, then at Maisie reading by the firelight. He had promised her a different life. He would need to be smarter, harder, and more cunning than the system already closing in around them. The hope was not gone, but it was getting ready to fight for its life. 3 years. The cotton on Huck's 10 acres grew high and white, a sea of promise under the brutal sun. His back ached in a familiar way, but the ache was different now. It was for something. He and Maisie, now 15 and strong, picked with a rhythm that felt like their own song. They filled sack after sack, the bowls sharp against their fingers. The way in was at the old gin house, now operated by a man named Sutter, A northern-born merchant Hood arrived with a ledger book and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Huck watched as Sutter's men dumped his family's cotton onto the scale. The iron weight slid, but Huck, who had learned numbers at the freedmen's school, narrowed his eyes. "That scale read 400 pounds last sack," Huck stated, his voice calm but firm. "This load same size. Why it say 380? Sutter didn't look up from his book. "Scales true, Freeman. Moisture difference. Tear weight. You tend your rows, ill tend the figures." A hot knot of anger formed in Huck's gut, but he swallowed it. Protest too loud, and the gin might break down for his cotton next time. He received a slip of paper, 380 lbs, x 8 cents, lb equal to $30.40. His share, after the land lease fee, was $15.20. It was less than Head calculated, but it was cash money, the first Head ever held. He walked to the Plantation store, also owned by Sutter. The shelves were stocked with bolts of cloth, shoes, tools, and food. The prices made his heart sink. A bag of seed corn was $4, a plow blade $8. The pair of shoes Maisie needed cost $3. He bought necessities, his $15.20 evaporating. At the counter, Sutter gestured to a large leather-bound book. "Now, Huck, you'll need seed for next season, yes? And that plow horse looks poorly. I can extend you credit against next year's crop, standard practice." Huck hesitated. Owning debt felt like a collar, but the alternative was planting nothing. He signed with his ex again. Sutter wrote elegant, looping numbers in the ledger. Credit extended, $25. That winter was hard. The credit bought seed and a little salt pork, but not enough. They lived on the corn and beans from their garden. Maisie's shoes wore through. At the community council meetings, a proud holdover from the early days, the stories were the same. Elijah owed $40. Old Sister Maybelle owed $18 for medicine. No one had seen a profit. The dream of saving to buy their land seemed to recede with every entry in Sutter's ledger. Then came the spring floods. The Mississippi swelled, swallowing Huck's bottomland for 2 weeks. When the water receded, half his young cotton plants were rotted sludge. He stood in the muck, the weight of the loss and the $25 debt crushing the air from his lungs. He would have to replant with more seed on credit. Sharecropping, they called it. Huck started calling it the maybe next year system. You worked maybe for yourself, but maybe for Sutter. Maybe you'd get ahead, but probably you'd just owe. The contract that had seemed like a gateway now felt like the walls of a pen. Reverend Jacobs preached from the book of Nehemiah, "We are building the wall, and the work is great. We are despised, but we must not come down from the wall." Huck clung to those words. He was building a wall for Maisie, but he could feel the enemy's Sutter's numbers, the flooded river, the suspicious white men who rode by gathering in the shadows, waiting for their wall to crumble. The air in Sutter's store was thick with the smell of tobacco and anxiety. It was settlement day. Freedmen from across Davis Bend stood in a ragged line, their hats in their hands, waiting to learn their fate from the ledger. Huck watched as Old Man Perkins, bent double from a life of labor, stepped forward. Sutter adjusted his spectacles and read aloud in a toneless voice. "Perkins, yield, 1,100 pounds cotton, value at 7 cents, $77. Lease fee, $30. Store account, $62.50. Balance due, minus $15.50. A collective gasp rippled through the line. Perkins had worked himself sick. His wife had died, and he owed. But Mr. Sutter, Perkins stammered, his eyes milky with confusion. The seed was $15. The medicine was $5. I don't understand the $62. Sutter sighed as if explaining to a child. Seed, tools, meal, cloth, interest on the credit, ginning fee, bagging fee. It's all itemized, Perkins. He tapped the ledger. "The book don't lie. You owe $15.50. It rolls to next year's account." "Next?" Perkins stumbled away, a broken man. Huck's mouth went dry. His own turn came. Head worked like 3 men. Maisie had too. They'd brought in 1,500 pounds. Huck, yield, 1,500 pounds. Value, $105. Lease, $40. Store account, $88.75. Your balance is minus $23.75. The numbers hit Huck like a physical blow. $88, he breathed. "We bought $30 worth, maybe. I can figure." Sutter's friendly mask slipped. "You calling my books false? You think I can't do sums? The debt is the debt, Huck. You want to contest it, you can take it to Magistrate Crowder in town." He smirked. Magistrate Crowder was Sutter's brother-in-law. Defeated, Huck signed the new contract, binding himself and his labor for another year to clear the impossible debt. As he left, he saw Elijah arguing with Sutter's overseer, a brutal man named Daggett. "I'm leaving," Elijah declared, his young wife clutching his arm. "This is peonage. We're going to Vicksburg to find wage work." Daggett simply nodded to a deputy sheriff leaning against the porch post. The lawman stepped forward. "You're under contract, boy. That debt's a civil judgment. You try to skip, it's a criminal matter. You'll work it off or you'll sit in jail." Elijah's defiance crumpled. The system had them. It wasn't chains, it was ink. The ledger was the whip. The contract was the auction block. That night, Huck sat by his empty hearth. Maisie placed a bowl of thin broth before him. "Papa, we can't stay," she whispered, her voice fierce. "We'll never own anything. We'll die owing." "Where we go, child?" Huck asked, the fatigue deep in his bones. "They got laws to bring us back. Daggett and his kind got the guns and the badges." He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes that the fields couldn't dull. "You're learning. That's the real crop, that they can't take from you. That's the harvest we gotta protect." He made a decision. He would play the dutiful sharecropper. He would nod and sign. But he would pour every ounce of his will into 2 things, protecting Maisie and finding a crack in the ink-stained cage. The war for freedom hadn't ended in '65. It had just moved to the ledger books in the courtroom. And Huck was determined to learn how to fight on this new, treacherous battlefield. Maisie, now nearly 20, stood before a chalkboard made from a scrap of slate. Before her sat a class of 15 children, their faces bright in the lamplight. The Freedmen's School, held secretly in Reverend Jacob's barn after dark, was illegal in the eyes of many white neighbors, but it was a fortress of the spirit. "Sound it out," Maisie instructed, pointing to a word. "Freedom," a little boy said slowly. "Freedom." A smile touched Maisie's lips. "That's right. Now write it." The scratch of charcoal on wood filled the quiet space. Huck stood watch at the door, a shotgun across his knees, not for show. 2 weeks prior, a school for black children over in Lexington had been burned. The Night Riders were growing bold as Reconstruction's protections frayed in Washington. Here, education was their quiet rebellion. If they could not control the land, they would master the word, the number, the law itself. Later that week, Huck made a dangerous trip. He walked 10 miles to the county seat to see a new lawyer, a young Jewish man named Abraham Cohen, who had come south with idealistic fervor. Cohen's office was small and shabby. "I want to see the land deeds," Huck said, placing a single hard-earned dollar on the desk. "For the Davis Bend parcels, my parcel, I want to see who truly owns it." Cohen looked at him with surprise, then respect. He returned an hour later, his face grim. "The land is held in a trust, Mr. Huck. The beneficiary is the former Davis estate. Your lease is essentially a tenancy at will. They can revoke it for any reason. The promised sale. There are no provisions." The truth was a cold stone in Huck's belly. There would be no 40 acres. Not here. The promise had been a phantom. But the debt, Huck pressed. Sutter's ledger. Can he do that? Charge what he likes? Under the lien laws, yes, Cohen sighed. The merchant's word on furnished supplies carries immense weight against the tenants. You would need impeccable, written records to challenge it. Do you have records? Huck thought of Sutter's elegant, incomprehensible script. He had nothing but his own memory. He left feeling both enlightened and imprisoned. Knowledge was power, but it also showed the immensity of the walls surrounding him. Back at Davis Bend, crisis struck. Daggett, the overseer, accused Elijah of stealing a ham from the smokehouse. It was a lie, but Daggett had a witness. Elijah was arrested and sentenced to 60 days hard labor, which meant working Daggett's private fields for free. His debt, of course, would continue to accrue. At the trial, Huck stood as a character witness. Elijah is a good man, he told the all-white jury. Your testimony is noted, the judge said dismissively. But we have a white man's sworn word against your impression. Huck walked home under a canopy of hostile stares. The law was not blind. It stared with Daggett's eyes. That night the community gathered in the church, not for celebration, but for solace. Reverend Jacobs didn't preach Exodus, he preached Revelation. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first things are passed away. Huck looked around at the faces etched with exhaustion and righteous anger. The first things, slavery and name, were past. But the new earth had not come. They were stuck in the cruel in-between. He knew then that Davis Bend was becoming a tomb for their dream. The vision of independence was being systematically murdered by ledger and law. To save Maisie's future, he might have to abandon the land he'd poured his soul into. The thought was a fresh kind of death. The knock came at midnight. Huck opened his door to find Elijah's wife, Cora, her face streaked with tears and soot. They burned it, Huck. They burned our cabin. Said it was for his insolence. Elijah's still in the county camp. They took my Noah. Her son was 6. Huck didn't hesitate. He grabbed his shotgun and woke Maisie. Get to Reverend Jacobs. Now. He followed Cora through the woods. The cabin was a skeleton of glowing embers. Daggett and 2 other men stood silhouetted by the fire, drinking from a bottle. Where's the boy, Daggett? Huck's voice cut through the night. Daggett turned, smiling. Run off, I reckon. Nits make lice. Best is gone. A red rage, decades deep, flooded Huck. He raised the shotgun. Daggett's hands went up, but his smile remained. You pull that trigger, old man, and every nigger in this bend will hang. You know the law. Huck knew. The law would see a black man killing a white overseer. It would be a massacre. His hand shook. He was trapped by the very system he wanted to shatter. With a cry of utter frustration, he lowered the gun. He spent the next 2 days searching the swamps with Cora. They found Noah hiding, terrified but alive. The community took Cora and Noah in, but the message was clear: resistance would be met with fire. The next settlement day was the final act. Huck's debt, after 8 years of labor, was listed at $122. He was 50 years old. He looked at Sutter, at the ledger, at Daggett leaning on the doorframe. He thought of Maisie, her spirit too bright for this dim prison. I ain't signing, Huck said, his voice clear in the stunned silence. Sutter blinked. Then you are in breach. You will be evicted, and the debt is still owed. I'll get a judgment lien. Get it, Huck said. He turned to the room of sharecroppers, their faces a mix of fear and awe. He can own that patch of dirt. He can own that book. But he can't own my next year. Or my child's life. Some of y'all. You remember what we was building before this store, before this ledger. That was real. This here is the ghost of slavery wearing a banker's coat. He walked out. That evening he and Maisie packed what little they could carry. Reverend Jacobs came to see them off. Where will you go? North, Huck said. Follow the river. Heard there's work in Illinois. Heard a man can breathe there. The debt, Huck. They'll say you're a fugitive from a civil contract. Let them say it in Illinois, Huck said, a grim resolve setting in his jaw. Done being governed by Sutter's arithmetic, they left under cover of a moonless night, joining a small group of others who had decided to risk everything. As they crossed the property line, Huck didn't look back at his 10 acres. He looked at Maisie, walking tall beside him, a bundle of books in her arms. Her education was the one crop the plantation store couldn't claim, the one seed he had planted that would grow in free soil. They were not just leaving a farm, they were fleeing an idea that their freedom could be quantified, indebted, and controlled. The journey would be perilous, hunted by both men and past promises, but the direction was the only one left, away. The cold was a knife. Huck, Maisie, Cora, Noah, and 5 others from Davis Bend had been traveling for months, moving at night, hiding in barns and woods by day. They were gaunt, hunted creatures. News had reached them that Reconstruction was officially dead in the South. Federal troops were gone. The redemption was complete. They heard tales of what happened to black people caught on the road without papers explaining their employment. They reached the mighty Ohio, the border between the South and what they prayed was freedom. The river was wide, black, and icy. On the other side, lights twinkled in a small Indiana town. A skiff was hidden in the reeds, as promised by a contact from the weakened but still breathing underground railroad network. "Last leg," Huck whispered, his breath fogging. Maisie's hand was cold in his. Suddenly, hoofbeats, torchlight flared through the trees. A voice, Daggett's voice, rang out. "Huck, I know you're there. You're a thief and a contract jumper. The law's with me." They had been betrayed. Panic surged. "Into the boat," Huck hissed, pushing the women and child toward the skiff. The others scrambled in, pushing off into the sluggish current. Huck turned. Daggett and 2 deputies emerged from the tree line, guns drawn. "You're coming back, old man, in irons or over my saddle." Huck stood on the bank, the water lapping at his heels. He looked at the skiff, Maisie's terrified face receding. He looked at Daggett, the embodiment of every overseer, merchant, and unjust judge who had defined his life. "No," Huck said, simple and final. "I ain't going back. My debt is to my child, to her future. You can't collect that. Your ledger ends here." He raised his hands, empty. Daggett smiled and stepped forward. As he did, Huck took one last deep breath of southern air, then stepped backward into the freezing river. The shock was absolute. The current grabbed him. He heard shouts, a gunshot that splashed harmlessly far away, and then Maisie's distant scream, "Papa!" He didn't fight the water. He let it take him, swirling him away from the shore, from Daggett's furious silhouette, from the entire state of Mississippi. He was a piece of driftwood, a leaf, finally free of the root that had held him in bitter soil. The cold was pain, then numbness. His mind drifted to Sarah, to the first cotton blossom had seen Maisie coax from the ground, to the sound of children spelling freedom in a dark barn. Strong hands grabbed him. He was hauled, choking, into the skiff. Cora and another man had turned back for him. He lay in the bottom, vomiting river water, Maisie sobbing over him. They reached the Indiana shore. A black farmer with a wagon was waiting, his face wary but kind. "You made it," he said simply. "It ain't paradise here, but the law's different. You own your own sweat." As the wagon carried them away from the river, Huck, wrapped in a coarse blanket, looked back one last time. The South was a dark mass against the sky. Davis Bend was somewhere in that darkness, a dream turned to dust, a lesson written in sweat and false numbers. But ahead was a tiny rented room, a job in a lumber yard, and for Maisie, a chance at a normal school. The debt to Sutter was gone, drowned in the Ohio. The only ledger that mattered now was the one they would write themselves. He had not won the land, he had not beaten the system, but he had broken its hold. He had traded 10 acres of haunted ground for his daughter's uncharted future. In the economy of freedom, it was the only transaction that had ever made sense. The war was over. His long emancipation at last had truly begun. If this story of resilience in the face of broken promises moved you, please share this video to keep these important histories alive. Subscribe to Tales of Slavery for more weekly stories that delve into the real, unvarnished struggles and strength of those who fought for freedom long after the chains were broken. Their legacy is our lesson,